Alright, so we're going to talk a little bit about the different paths in psychology today. We're mostly going to focus on clinical and experimental, just because they are the programs that we're in and we're most familiar with. But we're also going to cover a little bit about what master's level qualifications qualify you to do as well. So with clinical, most people associate it with therapy, but that isn't the whole job, and you can take a clinical psychology PhD in lots of different directions. But if you do want to be a therapist, there are some considerations that you might want to make when you're deciding whether or not you want to take a PhD path or a master's path. So the first thing that you want to be really thinking about is like, how long do you actually want to be in school? Especially if you just want to do therapy, maybe a master's program in like social work or counselling might be more suited for you, especially if you have absolutely no desire to do research. That takes about 2 years as opposed to 5 years plus more if you go down the PhD route. So yeah, do you want to only do therapy, and also what kind of clients do you want to see? So the difference between the clients that a clinical psychologist might see versus a social worker or a counsellor is that a clinical psychologist is going to see more clients with actual pathologies. So your more serious mental illnesses and like actual diagnoses of like major depression, OCD, various other anxiety disorders. And I think I'll cover a bit more of that later on. Oh, sorry.
You're doing it.
Yeah, okay. Alright, so there's the option of doing research in the clinical area. So if you are really interested in research and you're considering a career path in like academia or in another research facility, you want to be starting to think about what your research interests actually are. So if they do fall in the more clinical side, that might, pardon me, be more to do with like particular disorders, behaviours, actual therapy and treatments, relationships. It's really, really broad, health psychology, but they are a little bit different compared to if you go down an experimental path, which Heather will cover later. And do you want to do research full time, or do you want to do clinical work and research, or if you haven't made up your mind yet, PhD might be a better way to go because it does have more options and more ability to move around. Alright, so if you do decide to go down a PhD road, that could be in clinical psychology or counselling psychology or school psychology. There's lots of options. I'm going to more talk about clinical and counselling psychology because I know a little bit more about it. So the actual PhD program is about 5 years if you don't come in with a master's. Most PhD programs you will get a master's during the PhD. You can come in with already a master's, and that might cut it down to 4. And then you've got a 1-year internship, and then you've got postdoc as well, which will be 1 to 2 years. So it's not even just the time that you're here at school. PhDs do have both research and clinical training, so again, if you don't like research, a PhD just isn't for you. And most programs, if you walked in and said, I just want to be a therapist or just do clinical work, they're going to tell you that a PhD isn't the right path for you. It is needed if you do want to work in a university or an academic setting. They will look for PhD level qualifications. Both clinical and counselling psychology will get you registration as a psychologist. However, they generally see slightly different kind of clients. So counselling, they go for more of a strengths-based focus, whereas clinical psychology is like more of a scientist practitioner model. And counsellors, like counselling psychologists, are more likely to see people for more like adjustment issues and also like finding their path in life and that sort of thing, as well as pathologies. It's usually funded by a tuition waiver and a stipend. The stipends are not good. prepare to be poor for a really long time. And there are a lot of options where you can work with a PhD. So once you do get licensed as well, it can be like from hospitals, VAs, clinics, private practice, universities, research centres. It's very open depending on what your interests are and how you've guided your own training through the program. Yeah. Okay, so master's level, had to ask a lot of people about this because I'm obviously not American and things are kind of different here as well to where I come from. But it's usually 2 years. You can get a master's in clinical psychology. Most people use a master's in clinical psychology as a stepping stone to a PhD program, and most masters in clinical psychology advertise themselves to prepare you for a PhD. They can be used as a pathway to counselling licensure, or like to be a psychometrist, which is someone that might do like assessments in schools and stuff, but they still need to be signed off by a licensed psychologist. And some research roles, so lab managers, research assistants, things like that. But it won't lead to calling yourself a psychologist on its own. Social work and counselling master's programs, they are mainly going to be focused on training for clinical work and like out in the community. There's a lot of like practical placements and things on them, and they will lead to becoming a licensed professional counsellor or a licensed master or clinical social worker. So with those you can work in some states you can work in private practice, but you're going to work in a lot of like government agencies, treatment facilities, hospitals, things like that. It is a less competitive way to go. PhD application process is intense, and I think Anandi's going to cover that a little bit later. And it's not covered under any kind of tuition waiver, so it is going to cost money generally.
Okay, so experimental psychology. The fun part of psychology that doesn't talk about people's problems. You don't have to listen to people complain. It's super awesome. So there's 2 routes you can really go in experimental psychology. The master's level doesn't really get you very far, but you can get a Master's of Arts or a Master's of Science, either in general psychology or experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, all these fun things we'll talk about pretty soon. Also, if you don't know me, I talk very, very fast. It's just who I am as a person, sorry. But these are typically terminal type programs. So in master's degree programs, there's really no option for you to continue on for a PhD. Like they want you to get your master's, they want you to leave. In doing so, they also charge you for that program. So unlike the PhD programs, you don't get tuition waivers and you don't get stipends. You have to go get a big girl job or a big boy job while you're doing it. It can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years to complete it, depending on how fast you do your research or how fast you do your master's thesis. But again, mainly it prepares you for the PhD program. There are a few jobs available if you want to stop at this level though. For example, you can be a research assistant. So you can hop in any job that pays more than minimum wage and start being a research assistant. You can also be a lab manager. You can also go into market research with advertising, stuff like that. Really cool, fun stuff. You can also, at some community colleges, you can actually teach. Universities probably won't have you be a teacher, but you can do it at community colleges with just a master's degree. But the fun part, the part that really just beats you down and takes all of your life from you, is the PhD program. So approximately 4 years post-bachelor's. I know it's kind of confusing. You guys are like, why you should have a master's before you go into a PhD program. It's not really the case. You can go straight from a bachelor's into a PhD program, and you get your master's along the way. So kind of 2 birds with 1 stone there. You don't have to spend 2 or 3 years elsewhere spending money, etc. But if you do come in with a master's, note that it is not half a PhD. So you still have anywhere from 2 to 4 years to complete that. So master's is not half a PhD. Try to shoot for the PhD dual program. And these are very, very competitive programs. Most universities, like the acceptance rate is like 3% of the people that apply. So it's very, very competitive. In fact, I don't know if anyone's going to tell you about this later, but the APA puts out a book every year that lists all the graduate programs. It tells you their acceptance rates, and it tells you what they're looking for when you apply, and how many people get jobs afterwards, and how long it takes, and all that. But check that out, APA, great book. But when you go into a PhD program for an experimental psychology, you work with a very specific advisor. So when you're applying to these programs, you want to look for someone who's interested in doing the same things that you want to do. So you basically work under them, and they train you to do the research in that specific field. So it's not just the university itself, it's the exact advisor you want to work with and you need to look for. And usually, if it's a reputable program, you won't have to pay for your PhD. They will give you a tuition waiver. If you're out of state, they'll give you an out-of-state tuition waiver. They do give you a stipend, which, as she said, they're not that great. But it's enough to kind of live on if you like boxes and, stuff like that for a house. And stipends are going to depend where you go. Some universities offer, say, like a $30,000 stipend, which sounds great, but the cost of living there is so high that $30,000 doesn't really do you a whole lot. Other programs are around $10,000, which sounds horrible, but if you think about the rent in that area, you have to look at those things as well. Anyways, I digress. But many experimental programs are more focused rather than broad. Here at Ole Miss, we have just the experimental psychology. We have cognitive within that. We have social. We have developmental. We have behavioral neuroscience. It's all housed underneath one degree type. So instead of getting a specific degree, you're getting the experimental degree. But other programs, they have specific cognitive programs, or specific social programs, or specific developmental type programs. So those are just more focused on those areas rather than doing research in general. So for example, cognitive psychology. Hopefully all of you know what cognitive psychology is at this point. But it's the study of thought, basically. So you can do memory, intelligence, creativity is also underneath cognitive psychology. Social psychology, you're focusing more on social interactions with other people. So you're looking at the situations rather than the individuals necessarily themselves. Developmental psychology, studying children, how they develop, and this can even go into older age. Geropsychology is an actual thing too. Quantitative psychology is my favorite. In fact, the reason I'm here is because my program decided no longer to do quantitative psychology. It's the coolest one out there because you do statistics. You literally get to call yourself a psychostatistician. Come on, it's pretty awesome, right? But it's a very lucrative career because then you can actually help people do design and do statistics, whatnot. But not a lot of programs have this. Then we have industrial organizational type psychology. This is focused more on the workplace or even in advertisement and marketing. So if you're interested in how people interact with each other in work environments, this would be the route for you to go. Probably one of the highest paid psychologists out there. Yeah, so their programs are very, very competitive to get into. Then my other favorite, behavioral neuroscience. I have a degree in one of these. This is where you can actually work with brains. So you relate things that are happening inside brains to behavior. You work with rats. Work with humans, not at the same level you work with rats, but you work with chickens, a whole bunch of other fun things like that. Behavioral neuro is really cool. We actually have a B neuro minor here. You guys should check it out if you're interested in that. Forensic psychology. Everyone gets super excited about forensic psychology because we watch too much CSI. We think we're going to profile a bunch of serial killers. It's going to be awesome. That is not forensic psychology. Forensic psychology, you actually work with the government, you work with law officials, you're expert eyewitnesses for court cases. But if you want to actually psychologically profile people, you need to get a degree in law. That is not forensic psychology. My little sister is so sad about that. We also have health psychology, so you can actually work in hospitals and certain types of communities focused on health and how that relates to physical well-being. Educational psychology, it's also known as school psychology. Your school counselors, advisors, you can do those things with that degree. But there's a whole bunch more, a ton more different types of psychology out there. While I was researching some stuff for this presentation, I found out there's a thing called aviation psychology, where you actually study sensation and perception for pilots specifically. So aviation psychology, cool. Basically, if there's a thing, if it exists, there's a psychology for it, and you can go in and do that. So what would you actually do if you got one of these degrees and you studied one of these things? Obviously, the first thing is going into academia. You teach, you conduct research. So you'd actually be like a professor at a university doing those things. And sometimes, some universities, they'll specifically hire you just to do research so you don't have to teach. Some of the universities will specifically hire you just to teach and not do research. So if you're not on the research game, you can still teach, you just have to find the right place. Research centers, where obviously, guess what? You do research, right? Yes. So you can work for private research centers where they have a goal in mind, and your job is basically to do what they want you to do so you can find these answers for them. You can also go into government, again, doing research. You'll see this is a common theme. But you can do program development for schools. You can do program development for other types of things within government. Again, you can also be expert witnesses. So you can go up there and say eyewitness testimony, probably not a good thing. Don't use polygraph tests, not a good thing. There's another route. Then you can go into private business. And the private sector is really where the money's at. If you're all about the money and not like the love of the research, private sector is for you. Of course you'll do research, but you can also get into some marketing. So like when Walmart decides where we're going to put things on our shelves, they call someone who has a degree in this. Say, what are people most likely to do when they walk into the store? Well, they turn right, right? So the psychologist to tell them to put all the junk at the counters on the right side, so we buy. Anyways, that's all the fun stuff you can do. Again, if it exists, there's a psychology for it, and there's a job for it as well. Summary?
I'm just going to add as well that under clinical, like, you can specialize in nearly all of those things as well. So it is what kind of clinical psychologist you want to be, or what kind of experimental psychologist you want to be, and what direction you want to take that in. And yeah, so basically there are a huge amount of career options, and the common perception in the public is that psychology is therapy, and that is not the case. So having a good think about, yeah, what direction you want to go in, and what kind of career you want, and also what you enjoy about studying psychology, and if you follow that, you'll find where you want to be. Any questions?
I have one. What program are you in?
I'm in the clinical psychology program for PhD.
Okay, so is there a tuition waiver only for PhD?
So
We don't offer a terminal master's program here. So if you come in here, it's either PhD clinical or PhD experimental.
So some people come into the PhD program with a master's from somewhere else. Ole Miss does not offer it, but for example, like University of Memphis has a terminal master's program and they have a PhD program. So
the master's program that they offer here is like master's in clinical mental health.
it's a master's in science. Yeah.
But it's through the education part.
Yeah, it's not through psychology, it's through the education.
Oh, okay, yes. So that's a master's in counseling, and that's through the education department.
So I understand.
Yeah, and they do have a terminal master's, and then they also have